I've always been interested in working on systems. When I'm talking about systems, what I mean is that often we talk about issues as sort of siloed things. Climate's over here, poverty's over here, access to higher education's over here. But the fact is that all of those problems, they all exist sort of like within the same system. And a lot of times those systems intersect. Every time you change a policy, you are changing a system. Every time.
Rhiana Gunn-Wright wants to tell you that the world is more connected than you might think. She's the director of climate policy at the Roosevelt Institute and one of the architects of the Green New Deal, the sweeping, comprehensive climate legislation championed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortes and met by political opponents with, let's say, some criticism.
After reading the Green New Deal, I'm mostly afraid of not being able to get through this speech with a straight face.
The Green New Deal is expansive, it's comprehensive.
So how does a woman with fewer than 3 years of experience in the world of climate justice end up writing one of the most controversial and impactful climate bills in American history? Because she saw that everything in American power is connected, and she wants everyone else to see it with her. Born and raised in Chicago, Rhiana Gunn-Wright grew up with asthma.
And I had asthma to the point that by the time I think I was in like 3rd or 4th grade, I was out for like a week every spring. I would get sick and I would be out of school.
She didn't make the connection at the time, but we now know today that her asthma, like many others, was most likely linked to the air pollution in her neighborhood where she grew up.
The situation for a lot of other kids was that their parents worked hourly jobs, right? So every time your child is out of school, not only are you hurting their educational outcomes, you have mothers trying to figure out what to do about childcare. These things are all connected.
That connection has not only shaped Gunn-Wright's worldview, but the fundamental tenets of the Green New Deal.
A lot of what the Green New Deal did was just connect a lot of conversations that were happening already. Climate justice and environmental justice activists have been talking about how environment is larger than polar bears and ice caps in the Arctic. So it was just essentially trying to create a policy proposal that not just met the scale of the problem, but actually tried to address the problem as it exists in the real world, which is a mass of overlapping and interconnected issues.
The Green New Deal is a 14-page document, and it covers a lot of ground. It not only promises to get carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, but to add millions of green jobs, and makes the link that climate issues like fossil fuel emissions are justice issues, since people of color are more likely to live near power plants and other polluting factories, and they suffer higher levels of asthma and greater risk of early death from air pollution. While Rhiana's writing of the Green New Deal may be one of the most influential documents in the green space, she's a relative newcomer when it comes to climate justice. For her, she sees that as an asset instead of a hindrance.
When we talk about climate change, most times people are talking about super scientific stuff. Carbon footprints, parts per million, how much carbon is in the atmosphere. And there's this feeling, I feel like often in climate policy, that if you don't have a background in those things, you can't talk about it. But the fact is that most people experience climate change as economic effects and health effects. They experience it as Hurricane Katrina. They experience it as the wildfires in Paradise. They experience it as this heat wave where they don't have money to afford air conditioning. Climate change is not a partisan thing.
So Rhiana took this pragmatic approach all throughout her career. Originally, she was a policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department.
And Detroit is a hotbed for environmental injustice. When I was working there was an incinerator in the middle of the city. And around that area, asthma rates were like 3 times the state average. Residents were complaining that they couldn't go outside because it smelled so bad. So trying to figure out what to do about it, it just became clear that these things had health effects, but the reasons that it was happening were beyond what we could do for people.
So after working on Abdul Sayed's 2018 Michigan gubernatorial campaign and losing, Rhiana was looking for a job. So she emailed Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortes's campaign manager looking for something short-term. And when she was offered a job at New Consensus, a progressive think tank,
they were like, hey, so we are developing a Green New Deal, which is a mobilization on climate to restructure the U.S. economy and reduce emissions.
In addition, the idea was to create the lofty goal of zero waste, zero poverty, and zero racial wealth gap.
So they were like, oh, so you can write this whole thing in like 4 months, right? And I was like, no, but maybe if you give me 2 research assistants, we can try. And so that's what we did. No one does economic mobilizations anymore in the US. The last time we did that was in World War II. So the first thing we had to figure out was like, how do you actually run an industrial mobilization? What does that look like?
That's when Rhiana brought in other organizations to not only pitch ideas for what the Green New Deal should look like, but how to shift power structures and figure out how money should be dispersed.
So I work with the Green New Deal Network, which is essentially a coalition of movements.
But what became clear was the folks who had been put together were not climate justice organizers or advocates.
That's John Washington. He's part of the Green New Deal Network, and he's worked with Rhiana during his time at People United for Sustainable Housing, or PUSH. Initially, he had doubts about Rhiana's New Deal coalition.
They were folks who had had success, like Rhiana, in electoral work, but who had never done climate justice work. And so Rhiana recognized that there was a gap in that and really took it all in and built a relationship with myself and many others across the climate justice movement.
The only way we're going to figure out how to do such big intersectional policy is to have people from various, not only viewpoints and expertise, but people that are going to be affected by this in the room, talking to each other, building relationships, and working together.
One of those people she listened to is Lucy Velez. She lives in Buffalo, and she's a climate justice activist. While her story is only tangentially related to an environmental issue, it's actually addressing the knock-on effects that spill over into different but connected areas of life.
I thought, my cough was just a cough. All these congestion issues and colds were just things that normally, most people experience.
Like Rhiana, Lucy suffered from persistent medical issues from pollution most likely caused by the Peace Bridge, connecting Buffalo to Canada, which emitted emissions into the surrounding neighborhoods.
In the year 98, I got a house, and I thought that house was in good condition, but in 2016, I was hospitalized with like a lung and bronchial infection.
And when Lucy returned from the hospital,
I went into a room, which happened to be my office, and there was this black fuzzy mold.
That's when members of PUSH knocked on Lucy's door one day, and they were able to help her fix her house.
It took a while to find different funding sources to add up to the amount of money it was required to fix Lucy's home, because it was in pretty bad shape.
The cost to my house was $40,000 to cover the things that I needed.
So Lucy got her home fixed, and then a few months later, she gets a thing from KeyBank saying that they're redoing her mortgage because the value of her home has gone up. Her mortgage payment was doubled.
I didn't have the money. I couldn't find the money to pay for, that kind of jump.
And so she used part of her burial fund to pay her taxes so she could keep her house.
That's the problem with Lucy's situation. It started as a pollution-related issue, and that issue ended up affecting her mortgage. That domino effect is what the Green New Deal is trying to address.
That's what Einstein said, right? The consciousness that created a problem is not the consciousness that's going to solve it. So the consciousness of the nonprofit and private world is not what's going to solve the problem. It's the consciousness of the community. And so I think the Green New Deal Network and the team have started really to address that. They've started to build a national network of organizations that do this work and that understand what people in communities are experiencing.
Today's biggest issue with interconnected consequences?
For a fourth straight day, the coronavirus claimed more than 1,000 lives in this country. Infections are also still surging.
But with COVID spreading throughout the United States, it seems that climate issues, including the Green New Deal, are taking a back seat to the pandemic. But that hasn't stopped opponents making their feelings known.
What does placing emission standards on airlines have to do with getting Iowa families and workers the relief they need right now?
We're here trying to fight for the man and woman on the street in our hometowns, and yet they're fighting for the Green New Deal.
But Rhiana says that COVID and climate justice have one major thing in common. They both ravage poor communities of color, and it's not a coincidence.
If you look at the hotspots of COVID deaths, they basically mapped on almost directly onto frontline communities. One of the reasons why COVID ravaged communities of color was because we put toxic pollution there, and now COVID is taking them out at double the rates.
With Joe Biden's $1.7 trillion Green Initiative plan, some are calling it his own spin on the Green New Deal, so it's catching on in the mainstream. But Rhiana still knows she has a long, hard fight ahead of her, because ultimately, changing an entire system means getting citizens to realize their own power over that system.
We ran into a lot of people who would talk about how they felt powerless. But they always had power in some measure. And it's just really important to remember that you have the right to gather with other people. We all have the ability to emotionally affect another person, to make another person feel connected. And that is powerful.